Okay. Yes, Elizabeth, you did get sunburned. Holy moly, yes.
I didn't notice until I got on the Zoom and I was like, oh.
Okay. Get started. Everybody, this is Dan. He is a vocalist and he'll also be recording some of your pieces. He's worked with Fresh Squeeze Opera primarily in the character of a judge. Just by coincidence, he's played two judges for two separate productions. And he's new music and standard rap baritone. He also plays Dungeons and Dragons, and I have been in one of his groups, and he's a very good DM.
Oh, you're very kind.
Yeah, is there anything else you want?
I will also say I would have run the North Shore Music Festival, which is a producing organization that's produced about, I don't know, 15 operas over the last 10 years. We are on a hiatus due to COVID for the past, year and almost 2 years now, it feels like, because we usually just do the summers. And yeah, I realized as I was like preparing this, I made my professional debut on the operatic stage 36 years ago. And I was also a boy soprano at one point and sang some sort of professional regional stuff back then. And I have worked most primarily in opera, a lot of new music, as well as world music and musical theater over the last 30 some odd years. Anything else I think it should add? No? Okay. Is it better if I just talk, or is it better if I share my screen just so you can see my notes? I have a few handouts, Jillian.
Yeah, I'll make you the host so you can do whatever.
Okay. Awesome. All right. So these are my notes, so I apologize. I don't know if any of it is being spelled correctly, but we try. So I'm making a couple of presumptions about all of you, since this is the Fresh Squeezed Opera Vocal Lab, and it's that these three presumptions that you want to write opera or some sort of neighboring medium to it, and you have something that you want to say, you have music inside of you, you have something that you want to express, you want to push those boundaries, you believe that music you write should and needs to be heard by the world. I think that you believe that the music you write, I already said that, sorry. 3, you want to be paid for this. I think that it's a fair presumption of these three things. I'd like to help you do this more. I've worked a lot of shows from, beginning through the workshop process at like everywhere from like little local things all the way up to being part of the Sundance Theater Lab to workshop new operas in the past. So the things that I think are really important from my experience is that composers need to understand that they're working in a market. It is a market for new works. The musicians are also working on markets, so they have sort of those stresses on them, if you will, and what they do and what they do well is guided by that market. When you are creating pieces, you need to create things that are going to work through the line of production and the line of workshopping to be successful. And the third thing, which is probably most importantly, is that you need to have an audience that comes to your shows, that experiences it, that is compelled, that loves it, that is any of those things, but that they want to hear more and see more of it. And the truth is that unlike most other mediums in opera, the voice is really and the singers are going to be the primary face of your piece, if you will. They're the front men. They're the things that people will first identify with. So all the brilliant ideas, all the brilliant music that you write, the first way that the audience will sort of connect with it is through those singers. So I'm going to try today to give you I'll put this here because I'm forgetting this. So you need to be able to find singers that meet the demands of your music. You also need to find ways to write that will fit into the qualities of those voices. Sometimes it's a singer first thing where you find a singer like, I want them, and you have to figure out how do I write for them. And sometimes it's the other way around. I think I was going to give this, well, I'll give it right now. I'm not sure how many are familiar with the musical theater piece, Bridges of Madison County. Yes, no, kind of. So, okay. So this is a thing about writing for the singer. This was written for the musical theater and opera singer Kelly O'Hara. If you're not familiar with her, you should be. She's pretty damn good and a big deal these days. When Jason Robert Brown gave her the draft of the music that he had written for the show, she took it and within 24 hours said, yeah, you need to rewrite this. This isn't for me. And she was a very big deal at the time. And he was at first, apparently, this is all anecdotal, but at first a little bit thrown. And she had said, here, listen to these things I've done. He listened to it. And thank God he had the, should we say, the wherewithal to say, oh, you're right. This doesn't do what you do well. And so he rewrote, changed keys, he rewrote huge sections of it. It's in a sense the least like all the music he wrote before, and it's probably the most successful piece that he's ever written. So there has to be that collaboration, and you need to really write for those singers and write to their strengths, or you need to write a piece and find singers who have the strengths that you need. I have found that a lot of composers, especially ones who are first starting to write for the voice, or ones that sort of get stuck without getting the big successes, don't ever fully understand how a human voice, the operatic voice, works. And they tend to write for their voice a lot of times like they would a harp, or like anything you found in your, oh, I have it right here. The Study of Orchestration by Adler, which is the book I had in college, which I pulled out. And what I thought was fascinating when I looked at this is that he just doesn't address voices at all. It's got every instrument, anything else like that. And so I'll get pieces sometimes that are like at the top of my range, and then at the bottom of the range, and top of the range, and bottom of the range, and we'll spend the whole time in one part of my voice, which is in my range, but that doesn't quite make sense. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and how to make a better sense out of that. And then the other part of it, which I'm going to deal with the last 10 minutes, is what I'll call the triage section, which is a bunch of things that you can do that take less than 10 minutes that will make, one, your singers so happy to work with you, and two, will cut hours and hours out of their time in the prep that they can then spend actually learning your music and working on it. Okay? So we're going to try to do a very, very rough, dirty dive into singing, a little bit on technique, not too much, because there's still, that's a whole other doctorate that we can get. And as I've been going through literature, there's so many aspects that are really questionable about who believes they exist and who they don't. And I'm going to try to give you a little bit of a better sense on the way these things, the voices and how they work. So the first and foremost thing is that voices exist on a spectrum. And this is hugely too important to understand. There's a cello. The cello, any cello you get, is basically going to have the same low note, the same high note. And there isn't a huge, how do I put this? A huge tax on the cellist to play at the very top of the range or the very bottom of the range. You can argue this with me. There are aspects of it that are, not exactly true, of course, but it's not the same as with the human voice. And there's no such thing as a soprano. Most singers will fit into many different vocal Fachs. A Fach, if you don't know what that is the German term for part or the voice part. And we're going to talk about those. We're going to talk about the different language differences. Most of our sort of way we look at it today is based on the German-speaking world's Fach systems. The biggest thing to understand when we're talking about Fach, I think, is that, if you go on to like the New Classical Singers Forum on Facebook, people will go on about, I'm a this, I'm a that. Yes, I know what it is. You're Elizabeth, yes. They get really into it, but the truth is that the Fach system was built for contractual obligations. So when they started having this German annual system, you had to have a way that people couldn't say, well, no, I don't want to do that role. That's not what I want to do. And so they created this list, and it's in a book called Kloiber's Handbuch der Oper. It's right here. I should send a bibliography. I started one. I can email to you guys later. And it literally is, these are the parts that if you are this type of soprano, these are the roles that you are legally required to do if you sign that contract. So that way, it sort of worked in that way. And actually, one of my colleagues, she was in a landmark case about 10 years ago in Austria where these were sort of redefined and what that meant. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hand out one, which is basically what I will, for lack of a better term, a rubric on how we can talk about voices and what are the things that singers talk about when they talk about voices. I'm putting it in the chat, so you should be getting that. I have 3 handouts. I know you're excited. Who doesn't love a good handout? So the gross sort of factors, the big factors that we talk about are range, number 1. And it's from high to low. This is what you'll see when you go to your Adler book about orchestration, that the violin plays from this note to this note. If you go through the literature on voices, this is actually considered the least effective way to decide what a voice is or what a voice does well. And so I point that out here because it's a lot of composers in my experience have said, like, what's your range? Oh, I can sing from a low F to a high F. Great. And it becomes a piece where I'm going up and down. There are singers who can do that. And it's not saying that I can't do that, but there are, shall we say, trade-offs if that's what you want me to do. And so I want you to write music that's going to really show off the things that I do the best. Just like with anyone else you hire, I want them to show off what they do the best. So the second thing here is tessitura. Does anyone know this term? I'm not actually sure. You do, Elizabeth. I know you were a singer. Anyone else ever hear this term? Okay, Jonathan, great. Leo, awesome. So a tessitura.
A tessitura is a fantastic fundraising software.
Okay, so when we're not talking about fundraising, I actually think this is probably the most important thing that I'm going to talk about, is that it's 2 things. One, it is the, in a given piece of music or given role, it's where most of the notes lie. So although a soprano may have a range from a C to a C, or middle C to a high C, they don't sing that entire range most of the time. In fact, what they do, and you look at most of the writers, is that they will go anywhere between a fourth or an octave is about the effective tessitura for most singers. And most of the time they want to live in there. And of course you will have excursions above or below for climactic moments. But if you're looking the entire time at a piece of music and everything's super high or everything's super low, or I should say, if you want to look at the staff, it's all way above the staff or all way below the staff, it may not be written for that voice as effectively as you could. And my goal, as I said, is I want you to have really effective choices in the singers that you get and in writing for them. I got a bunch more information here on this. Let me just see what I wrote. Synonym, sometimes you'll see in some older text that tessitura is used for range. This is just false. Octave to a fourth, I said that, refers to the most common range where notes throughout a roll of voice become tired. Good, I said that too. I'm getting through this faster than I thought. So how do you determine a tessitura of a singer? So the sort of the biggest down and dirty way that I would say is that if you take about a perfect fourth from the top and bottom of the voice, so if I gave you a range of, let's say, a low F to a high F or a high G, you would then say, okay, I probably want to spend most of the time from that C to probably about that C above, would be a very good way for me to sing for a long time without tiring. We'll talk about why we don't want to tire the singers if at all possible. Another approach, as I said, is the clefs. I remember when I had to take my score reading things where I had to learn the alto clef and the tenor clef and the French baritone clef, and I was not very good at that. I will admit that right now. There were too many clefs. But it was a really smart tool for writing, I thought, because, as I said, the bass clef is, for a bass is very accurate. For a baritone, if you think of it all about a step higher, and then for a tenor, the G clef is pretty good because that middle line is B. And so staying more on the staff is going to be sort of just, as I said, very blunt, very loose approach to it, but it's going to be much more effective. So the third thing that we talk about when we talk about voices is the timbre, or timbre, depending on which version of English you speak. I say timbre, but this refers to the vocal color or the quality of sound. This is something that's super subjective. People will hear things very differently. People will record differently. And so you'll hear things like this person's voice is dark, or it's light, or it's bright. Sometimes you'll hear things like metallic, and even like Germans, for example, will go on about the Silbertone, the silvery tones, or the brass. And one of my favorite singers, George London, they talked about his voice being like burnished brass, which it's like, what does that sound like? If you have synesthesia, you can probably draw it for me. I don't have synesthesia. And down here we now have weight, and the weight is it's a volume. It's a two parts. It's one, it actually describes the decibel level of that voice, and it also will describe, it's sort of tied in with the timbre there. A heavier voice normally will have a lower tessitura of a similar voice type with a similar range, and they're sometimes used for like synonyms for larger or smaller voices. A side note here, Joan Dornaman, if you're unfamiliar with her, she is one of the most influential operatic coaches of the last 50 years. And pretty much every telecast from the Met you saw from like 1970 to about 2010, she was the assistant conductor because she prompted them. And I'll probably mention her before again, but she talked about how we don't need big, small voices. We don't need high or low or any specific type. We just need really good ones of every type, which I really loved, and it was important for me to hear as a young singer. And so I'm also going to encourage you as a composer to write for all of them. And there are a lot of different types. So a side note, as I was going through here, jumping ahead, but we have sort of three weights that people often use, which is lyric, dramatic, and held in. And so the orchestration you'll almost always find under a lyric voice is a string orchestra. With a dramatic voice, you'll hear strings and winds. And with a held in or heroic voice, you'll often hear percussion or brass instruments come in there too. Perfect examples, if you go into Salome and whenever Johannahan starts singing, the brass is just blasting away there, and you need a voice that can cut over that or through that. We then talk about agility. So agility, when we're talking about a voice, is their ability to sing turns, to sing rapid notes up and down the scale. And it's one of the factors that we deal with when separating what's called a coloratura voice and like a lyric coloratura soprano and a regular lyric soprano. I'm going to go through all these ridiculous amount of things, and I think I have 28 voice types that I have listed in my thing, and I'm going to give you a listening list for yourself, because I realized if I start to play all 28, that's like 2 hours later. So the finer factors, flexibility. This is not the same thing as agility. Flexibility here is talking about an ability of voice to do crescendo, decrescendos, to sing in the different parts of the range with any dynamic that you would possibly write. Not all voices can do this. And it doesn't mean that they're bad singers or bad voices, it's just that they sort of have specialized into these areas. And as I said before, as a composer, I think it really behooves you to understand what those are, because these are tools in your toolbox. They are weapons in your arsenal to write the music that you want to write and to get it out there. And again, I've spent an inordinate amount of time in some of the workshopping where the composer wanted something that a singer just couldn't do, because either they didn't listen to what the singer could do, or they just sort of had this mind in what they wanted, and they were trying to fit someone into that round peg, square hole situation. So next on here, I have registration. You may have heard people back from your choir days in high school about the chest register or the middle register or the head register. A lot of people will argue about this. Voice scientists do as well. But for our purposes, you can think about it as a sort of a top, middle, and low. And what's important here to know is that there are certain voice types that are traditionally strong or weak in those different areas. So a lyric soprano, for example, will have a very strong top, where the dramatic soprano, who has the exact same range, will have a strong middle. Or the dramatic mezzo soprano, which also has the same range, essentially, maybe a half step different, will have a very strong middle and a very strong low, but maybe not the most easy to get to top. Along with that, there are a lot of voices that will have traditionally weak areas. So for example, tenors generally, although some of them sing low, unless they're a heavier, more dramatic type of tenor, like a light lyric tenor is the opposite of that, they traditionally don't have many low notes. And I've been on stage with more than one who just opens their mouth and pretends they're singing notes, and no one can hear them. And they don't care, because they're tenors, and tenors are like that sometimes. So the next thing, as far as finer factors, is this thing called passaggio. Uh, Again, I know that Elizabeth, you are a singer, but other people familiar with this idea of passaggio? Good, Jonathan. I guess you're a singer too? Sweet. So in this idea of registration or the voices is that there's what the passaggio is that it is a change in the valvular function of the larynx going from one register to another, meaning that the vocal folds, when they're going from certain notes to other notes, are going to change the way that they vibrate and the parts of it. You probably don't need all that information, but what you do know is that going along with that tessitura idea is that if you have a singer singing in their passaggio for a majority of the time, they're going to get very tired very quickly and often will have to drop out of the production. So we want to avoid that with most types of voices. Okay, so now singers have their entire, gonna take a breath here. Everyone sort of with me so far? I'm trying to get a lot, like I just thrown information at you and I apologize. There's just a lot that I felt like I had to say and I want you to have information. So when you're talking with singers, they have their own weird ways of talking about themselves and I want you to be able to decipher this. So some singers, you ask them and they will refer to themselves by the roles that they sing, or they may be interpreters of certain composers, or they may talk about a particular type. So like I know singers who say, I'm a Mozart Strauss soprano, or just Mozart Strauss singer. Or they'll say something like, I'm a Wagnerian. Or they might say, I'm a bass baritone. Or they may say, I sing Mimi, Countess Sophie. And as you begin to be, as you're more familiar with the repertoire, that sort of starts to make some sense. And if you look at, for example, with, I'll go back to the Mozart Strauss, uh, the way that the voices lie, the tessitura is very similar. The ranges are very similar. The demands on these things up here that I talked about, this rubric, for lack of a better term, are very similar in the way that Strauss wrote and Mozart wrote, especially for the women. For the men, not so much with Strauss. There are also a lot of voices that will hyper specialize in certain composers. And those are generally composers that are performed quite a bit. So you'll hear things about Wagnerian singers, meaning that they sing the work of Wagner, obviously. Rossini tenor is a very high tenor that can move very, very huge agility and huge flexibility. Generally not a big voice and generally not a lot of low tone. A Verdi baritone is another one you'll hear, and that's sort of the leading protagonist in most of the Verdi operas. And it's generally a big ass voice. It can sort of maintain a fairly high tessitura for a baritone, and has a lot of colors to it. You're also going to hear adjectives, and this is where I'm going to start talking into it before we get into all the ways that they, the box that are sort of defined. And so the first thing is that we have lyric, dramatic, spinto. So the lyric voice is considered sort of the lightest of them. You'll also hear people refer to light and full, which will be an additional adjective. But the lyric voice, originally all voices were lyric. Most young voices are trained as lyric voices. So if you're dealing with college level or people who are probably in their 20s, you're going to think more towards the lyric, whatever type of voice. Dramatic, bigger voice, usually lower tessitura. When they get up there, they're bringing a lot more vocal weight, a lot more volume. And the spinto is an Italian term, and it's sort of in between dramatic and lyric, depending on how you sort of see it. And this is where it gets very gray, a lot of gray areas because, again, spectrum. So next we have this idea of light versus full versus leggero. Leggero is considered the highest and lightest of voices. You'll usually hear that in regards to sopranos, and tenors will be leggero. Sometimes it's used almost as an insult, but again, it usually means very high, use very light voice. The fuller voice will have a more, shall we say, a richer tone, weightier sound, higher decibel. Then we have coloratura. And one thing that I have been emphasized by several people when I told them I was talking to you is that not everyone is a coloratura. And when we think of coloratura, most of us really think of the coloratura soprano like someone like a Barbara Hannigan. And if you don't know her, look her up after because she's remarkable. And the coloratura generally has 2.5 to 3 octave range, where most voices have about two octaves that they have accessible to. And part of the thing with the coloratura is that they live up higher. They are happy with a much higher tessitura, and there are some actually physiological reasons for that, which I will touch on briefly in a little while. So the thing is that other voices will sometimes use this term coloratura. Sam Raimi, who's a very famous bass, was often referred to as a coloratura bass. You'll hear about mezzos being coloratura mezzos. When we're talking about voices other than soprano, it is not about range. It is about how fast their agility can move up and down, as opposed to having this extension of about a fifth compared to the normal range, and their ability to live up there in that higher tessitura. See, I keep on saying tessitura, super important. That higher tessitura is something that is really exclusive to the coloratura soprano. So, historically speaking, the coloratura mezzo, for example, or alto, will be a lot of things by Rossini is one of the perfect examples. And most of that lives below the staff. And it goes up and down, but they live the most of their time singing towards the bottom of the staff or even below it, even though they're coloratura. So going into a little bit of history now and historical, we have something called pants rolls or skirt rolls. And so it's a very common idiom in opera that you will have young men being played by women dressed in skirts, and other way around. Young men played by women dressed in pants. And oftentimes, most of the time I've seen it in Italian opera where it's an older baritone or bass will be dressed in skirts playing an old woman. But this also has a lot of wiggle room. I know that in some of the Spanish operas, they will often have the tenor dressed in skirt rolls, which I sort of think it's interesting when different nationalities have different traditions of the way they hear sound. So when I give you this information, it is to inform you, but by no means am I trying to say you need to fit into that mold. The next thing we have as far as these adjectives is we have this term buffo. Buffo is an Italian term. It usually means, it's supposed to mean buffoon or funny. However, it's often referred to what I'll call like the heavy, where it's usually this sort of scary guy that's on stage or scary woman on stage that's really threatening, and it's more that they're so threatening that it becomes very funny, if that makes some sense. Now, again, we talked about the German. I'm going to talk about this again, but we have 4 terms here: seriöse, character, Spiel, and Zwischenfach, which are German words that are very prevalent in the English language approach to opera. So the serious is, these roles that are, I would say, are considered very leading dramatic roles. The voices are generally more dramatic, where the character and Spiel roles in the German system and the American system, they aren't exactly the same, but they often require a lot more acting, if that makes sense. Some of them being funny. Spiel is sort of Schauspiel, means actor. So the Spiel role is like an acting role, and the character role, character. And then the Zwischen is what they will use as a term, or people will use a term to describe themselves when they sort of don't fit enough in one category or are really strong in multiple categories of voices. And then the other way that I'm going to talk is that people in different countries, because you're writing for opera, it's an international thing, people will sort of describe it differently. As I said, the Germans, they have the seriöse, they have the Spiel, they have the Charakterfach. They'll also talk about the Zwischen and the Helden, meaning heroic, the Zwischen meaning the in-between, and the lyric, where Italians will pretty much only talk about weight. It is the leggero, the lirico, or the lirico spinto. And they don't even have dramatic. They have lirico spinto, which means lyric, a pushed lyric voice. It's a very different mentality. And being American, I've had a lot of my experience here, and Americans tend to talk about nationalities of voices. So you might hear like, oh, that's a French soprano or a German baritone or an Italian tenor. And they sort of, a lot of Americans in the field will think about a voice matching a certain nationality's color. Okay, time for handout 2. This is the Fach. So I took this from a wonderful, wonderful resource. Do I have it here? I don't. But this is a whole big basically breakdown of the 28 or so different Fachs. So I know you thought SATB, or maybe you didn't, maybe you knew more, but there are essentially the most types of soprano Fachs because we have the most sopranos singing. As we go down, it sort of becomes a little bit more hazy and fuzzy about what voices do and what they do well and what they don't. And I wanted to just sort of touch on that. Did you all get that handout? Okay. So that first page, it sort of talks about each voice, what has it on there. And then what I love about this little book here, can I move that over there? Hold on. Give me 1 second. Oh, come on. There we go. There we go. It goes through what voices, how they might be classified, and the four major languages of opera, which are English, Italian, French, and German, and how they might be called in different languages. So certain voices do not exist in certain countries. So a bass baritone doesn't really exist in Italy. You're either a bass or you're a baritone. There is no such thing. There isn't really a Zwischenfach in Italian as well. You know, the French, they have different ways of hearing voices. And so we're even in this country, compared to other countries, you'll hear certain voices will be cast for certain things and fashion will change. And so certain roles over the years will sort of migrate where it was a lyric baritone thing one year, and a few years later, you may find it's only sung by dramatics. And part of that has to do with what people have success in. And if you go down to the third page, which I think, as I said, this is amazingly useful resource. It goes through all of the voices. It talks about the normal range that you should expect. It talks about what registers are good. And with this, that means where their tessitura generally is. So, you know, a dramatic contralto, for example, you want to hear the top and you want to hear the bottom. Both of those are going to be good, but the middle, notice they don't mention. They mean that. Most dramatic mezzos that or contraltos have amazing ear-splitting sound on bottom and on top, and sort of the sound becomes ephemeral for a little bit in the middle. And that's just sort of how it is. And this, as you can see here, it goes through the timbre, the weight, the vocal challenges, and the acting challenges of those roles. Does that make some sense? As I said, I've found this since I found this book, maybe, I don't know, 15 years ago, one of the most useful things that I have ever found. So I want to talk now about some of these voices. So the soubrette is this thing you'll hear a lot about, and it's generally, it can be any type of voice, female voice. It usually means the clever little girl, the young girl, and it's about the acting and age. So a lot of young sopranos, whatever their voice develops into, will start out as soubrettes if they happen to be young and sprightly and sort of energetic. The lyric, again, I'm not going to go through all of them just because there's so many. The light lyric coloratura, we will have that extension on top we talked about. They are known for having sort of the highest range and being able to have the highest tessitura. Then we have things like a light lyric soprano is a fairly common Fach, and someone like Susanna in Figaro or Sophie in Werther Rosenkavalier are sort of like the key roles. If you do not know some of these operas I am mentioning, they are things that you should know if you want to write opera, because this is what all the singers are trained on. We get to the full lyric coloratura. They'll have a little bit more weight to them. The two best examples I thought of was Cunegonde in Candide or Juliette in Romeo and Juliette. So we get to the full lyric soprano is sort of now a little bit heavier. This is what you think of as you think of the Puccini soprano. Their biggest quality is that they just have beautiful voices. If you hear a good lyric soprano, they generally it's exquisite and they just sing everything perfectly. I kind of hate them sometimes. I have a lot of friends who are lyric sopranos, and it's like, I just wish I could sing that perfectly at all times. So the light dramatic coloratura, this is where I probably would put Barbara Hannigan if you listen to her. This is sort of one of these singers that you can write anything. You can write like a harp and they'll be able to sing it. They can sing high, they can sing low. They usually have 2.5 octave ranges. The dramatic, usually their roles will be on the edge of madness or sort of with some sort of fiery energy. So you'll have things like Cleopatra or Lucia and Lucia de Lammermoor, or Violetta, or Anne Truelove in Rake's Progress. That's sort of what that light dramatic coloratura soprano is. The spinto, again, we're now getting into a fuzzy area. It's a bigger version of the lyric, or it's a lighter version of the dramatic. It's got a more Italian color. You can argue about this, but if you've seen operas like Tosca, or that would be a spinto soprano. Along with that, Minnie or Butterfly or Angelica and Suor Angelica, these will all generally fall into the spinto soprano. And as I said, a lot of voices will work for 5 or 6 Fox. One of my teachers in undergraduate was John Shirley-Quirk, wonderful bass baritone. A lot of the Britten operas were written for him, and he fit into 7 different Fox according to, the lists of what you are. Don't want to go too much more into this, but with the drum, we'll cut a little bit. When we get to the mezzos, if there are lighter voices, a lot of the mezzo, how do I put this, will be cast as sort of the brothers, the friends, the sisters, secondary parts, unless you have a lot of them will end up sort of being in those charactery parts. The full lyric mezzo is actually pretty much ignored in the operatic repertoire, unfortunately. So a lot of them will sort of rebrand themselves as what we would call a mezzo contralto, which is having that low range and high range. And things like Dalila or Carmen now would be considered into that range. We have the countertenor, which is generally considered a man who sings in the female register using a falsetto. And again, with the world that we're living in today, this can have a large spectrum. I have a student who is non-binary, and when I first started working with him, he was a baritone, and over the last year or so, he's transitioned up to singing in that range. And whether he calls himself a mezzo-soprano or a countertenor is still sort of, should we say, it's still in process of determining where it lines up best. When we fall into the tenors, what I think here is important is that we have the light, the full lyrics. We've talked about that. That spinto dramatic, those are sort of gray. And then we have the heroic. The heroic or the Helden is going to be almost sounding like a baritone, except can manage to get up to those high B, Cs and can stay there for a longer time. When, as a, really, as Jillian said, I am a baritone. My agents list me as a bass baritone, so I work sort of in those areas, and there's a huge amount of overlap, especially when you get with the lower ranges. But so the light lyric baritone, you're going to see this in Gilbert and Sullivan. You're going to see this a lot in Rossini, a lot higher, lighter. The full lyric baritone, you're going to see things like Papageno, or you'll see things like in Magic Flute, or come si dice in Avantikite, he sings it in Faust. I can't remember the name right now, but the Valentin in Faust. When we get into the world of the dramatic baritone, of the bass baritone, and the lyric baritone, these really cross over a lot. The dramatic is considered a very dark, heavy voice. It's going to have a lot of weight and a lot of cutting power. And the bass baritone and the dramatic baritone will often cross over, and the bass baritone and the lyric bass will often cross over. The comic bass can be almost any type of bass. It can even be a baritone at times, but who has great facility with sort of languages and making sounds and doing lots of these comic things, which is all based on the Commedia dell'arte tradition. So if you're not familiar with that, it's a revelation when you do learn about it, because so much of the music that you hear in Rossini and in even Handel and these early operas are based almost exclusively on the movements that were traditional in the movements, because like different characters will move in different ways at different rhythms on stage, and all they did was they wrote down what they saw. It's fascinating. So, as I said, so much information to give you about voices. Can't make you listen to them all. So instead, I made you a listening list, and I've gone through the 28 Fox or so, and I've given you 3 examples of each one. And whenever possible, I've gone with people who are either dead or are alive and no longer singing. And the reason for this, so you understand, is that their work is now sort of set. You should be able to find all these on YouTube, a little Google foo. You know, on Spotify, I found most of them, as well as on Apple Music. But there's been different movements, and as we start to do these different broadcasts of operas, there's been a huge shift where a lot more emphasis has been put on the physical characteristics of singers overall. So someone tall and good looking who may not have the biggest voice may be put in a big role that's normally done by a dramatic voice because they sort of look young, good looking, and that's what we think they should look like. It's ended up with some of the not best singing, and I'm not saying everyone that way, but at least with these people, they fit very well into the different Fox. Now with voices, there are a couple of technical things that I think is important for composers to understand. And the main one that I want to talk about was something called the singer's formant, or the third formant. Has anyone heard of this? Yes, no? Okay, so some people do actually, depending on their pedagogy, will learn about it. But it's actually, a formant is a space that is formed inside of the vocal tract of a singer. And generally, you know, when I was first being taught about this, they were 4. Now there are theoretically up to 8. And some are above and some are below the vocal folds. The third formant is formed directly above the vocal folds, and it's sort of this sound that you'll hear in a lot of singers. And it creates a cycle of 2,800 cycles per second of frequency in their voice. And that's that cut. You may hear the word cut or squillo or sgrinta. That's my personal favorite. And it is a cycle that allows a voice to cut over orchestras. Before I talked about coloratures being in many ways the exception. In this, they are the exception, is that coloratures do not require that to cut over the orchestra because of the high frequencies of their voice, but every other voice does. Now, why is this important to you? It is important to you because those voices, it is a muscular shape that has to be formed inside of the throat, and that if it stays static for too long, it will get fatigued very quickly. And as a result, voices will not do well while they are singing with that. And let me just see, is there anything else that I need to talk about there? No. So now I'm going to talk a little bit here. I know I'm running out of time, so I want to get to it all. I still have like a bunch of stuff. The human voice, as we've talked about, especially the operatic voice, it does not function like any other instrument that you learned about in orchestration classes or that you've played, because of this idea of tessitura and because of the way that the human voice makes sound. Now, the biggest thing here that I will say is that the human voice is embodied, it is internalized. As a result, things like stress and frustration or these things will have profound effects on the human body. And so I want you, when you write music for them, to consider this. Stress and anxiety, it's going to have a huge part. So it's going to be part of your responsibility, especially in these initial stages, to try to find ways to ameliorate some of that, or write in ways, again, keeping in mind their flexibility, their tessitura, their range, their weight of their voice, so that it's not causing things that are outside of that. Now, if you hear I'm talking about fatigue of the voice, you know, when you play a piano, if I sit down and play the piano now until midnight, my piano is not going to get tired. The human voice does. And the reason for that is, again, technical aspect here, is that the vocal folds, which are located inside of here, have essentially 3 layers of muscle. And the 3 layers of muscle are of decreasing density. And the very top layer is incredibly watery. Almost the way I would describe it to my students is what I would call baby jello. If you think about like that jello you get into a hospital that they feed to babies, it's like, ugh. And every time that we make any sound, whether we're speaking or singing, some of that gets brushed off, which is why singers, if they don't sleep well the night before, will sound like crap. It's the truth. I've had that experience myself. The good thing is this sort of rejuvenates very quickly. However, when a singer gets things that are technically very, very demanding and outside of their wheelhouse, or they're very stressed or things like this, they will start to, instead of using that outer layer, they will start to try to grip in here and use that middle layer or that bottom layer and push those together, which will increase the rate of that happening. So when you hear that happening, you see that happening, that's when the voice is going to get fatigued and tired much more quickly. So again, writing to their skill set is going to be key for this. And the other thing that I want to bring to your attention is that, and this is something I tell every single one of my students, is the second that you open your voice to sing, your IQ will drop by at least 20 points. And this is very true. There is actually reason for this, and it's the adrenaline that starts pumping. That fight or flight mechanism makes a lot of the higher brain functions shut down. And so one of the things that I'm going to push here, and I want you to think on, is simplicity. And I'm going to get to the simplicity in about 2 minutes. The other thing that I had an ex, and she was a very, very prominent coach. And one of the things that she always brought up, especially with composers when we were working on new things, is that singers don't have internalized rhythm. Or sorry, singers don't have externalized rhythm. Every other instrument that you're dealing with has some place that on your body you are making that tapping, you are making that rhythm. Whether it be the violinist who's bowing and pressing on the fingerboard, whether it be the trombonist who's moving that back and forth and blowing it here, a singer has no rhythm that comes outside of himself. A pianist, obviously touching the keys and the pedals. These are things that, although if you are not a singer, you take for granted that you have some way of keeping track of that. A singer has none of that. So when you're dealing with rhythm in your writing, it is helpful to think about that. Yeah. The same thing is in here with the pitch, where a lot of, shall we say, especially at the younger ages or the initial ages, incipient ages of music making, you can sort of, let me play on the piano, let me hear what this sounds like. And you can sit there and you know if you move your finger here, you move your finger there, you can play the right interval. Most singers do not have perfect pitch. And so they have to internalize the sound as well. And there is no externalization of that. And that will affect their stress levels, their anxiety levels. So these are things to keep in mind. So tessitura, we've talked about at length now. Hopefully you have a better idea of it. How do you figure out what a singer's tessitura is? So the couple of ways that I think are really effective is, one, ask them, hey, what are your audition arias? A singer will have 5 audition arias if they are a professional that they generally have ready to go. You can look those up. Very rarely are there things that are so wacky and weird that you can't just go to IMSLP and download them. If you look at those pieces, you will see what that singer thinks they do best. And so if you want to write for the things that they do best, that is like easy. Or if you look at it and you say like, this is someone who sings way up here and all that, and that's not what I want, that's not right either. You need to write it differently, or you need to find a different singer. Another way to do it is to look at what roles they've done. Again, the existing repertoire is hugely, hugely helpful. And all the singers that you deal with will have spent their entire professional careers trying to master the challenges of that repertoire. And so if you can look at the same things and say, hey, this person really sings a great me. What is me? How do I define that? Where is that tessitura for that role? What is the high? What is the low? How much time do they spend there? What does that voice do well? If you write the same way, not saying this has to be Puccini, but if you write in your music in a similar fashion, it's going to have singers jumping at the chances to do it, because they're going to be like, oh, this feels just like me. I love this. So you want that. Another thing that I would say is that a lot of singers, especially as they get more professional, will, instead of looking at voice categories, will actually follow the historic, what singer sang this first, and then go through what other roles did that singer do. So for example, myself, one of the singers that always resonated with me historically was a baritone by the name of Victor Morel. And Falstaff was written for him by Verdi, as well as Tonio and Pagliacci. Both of those roles, I'll get up and sing it for you any time of day. It's like getting a massage. I love it. And I found that everything else that was written for him, or that he did and was famous for, I found that's really great to sing. And so that's another way, is that a singer will say to you, hey, I really do this role well. Go to Wikipedia. Who did it? What else did they do? My wife and baby just came home. And I will say, one of my favorite things that I tell some composers I've worked with as sort of an experiment is what I say, what would George London do? Which is based on, of course, the What Would Jesus Do? Is to pick one of these singers and try to write specifically for that voice. I just gave you a list of like 75 singers. You could pick any one of them. You'll find singers who fit into that today and identify with that voice. And if you try to write for that voice, it's a very good, I would say, exercise, experiment in composition that can lead. I'm sorry, baby girl. Sorry, she's upset. Now, I'm also going to talk about simplicity. Now, as I said, the singers don't have the internalized rhythm. They don't, sorry, the externalized rhythm, the externalized pitch. They are, in a sense, they're sort of floating there by themselves, and it has to all be by the brain processes and their tradition or their condition. And they also became dumber because they started singing. So I'm going to behoove you to write as simply as possible. Do not ever try to impress me with your complexity. I've consulted on so many albums, so many records over the years where people will come like, oh, listen to all this cool stuff I did. And it's like, yeah, no one's going to buy that because we don't react well to the complexity. And really, there's that misquoted thing where it's like, sophistication is the height, or simplicity is the height of sophistication. It's supposed to be Da Vinci. It wasn't. That's a whole other story. And I'm also going to tell you a brief story. How many of you guys watch Top Chef? If you don't, the most recent season, I think it was, they had Dawn Burnell, who was down in Texas, and she was one of the finalists, and she was brilliant. But she would make these incredibly complicated dishes with 14 components. And they come in there, and every single time there was something she left out. One of the key ingredients, because she planned something that was beyond what she was capable of executing. So as you are writing music, as you're looking at commissions, as you're looking at voices, try to do things that we can execute and execute them really well, as opposed to try to really impress me with all the cool shit you want me to do. And with this, I'm also going to say with meter and rhythm, I cannot tell you the number of times I've gotten pieces of new music and had to rewrite it all in 3/4 or 6/8 because there are multiple very complicated key meter changes, rhythms that don't quite make sense at first, and I'll spend hours working them out and finally realize, oh, there was a case a few years ago with Fresh Squeezed Opera, and there was, Jillian, if you don't mind me telling, and it was a piece where it was like 2 pages, 3 pages of music, and every every measure changed meter, and the guy was having a conniption. And finally, it's like, we sort of had the thing was like, oh, he's doing all this to get the rhythm of the words and give the emphasis with the downbeats. And so he made it so complex that the singer just basically was having a breakdown trying to put it together. And once the singer thought of it all in 4/4, it was like 30-second job, he finished it. It was not a problem. So you have to balance that simplicity. I am not telling you to write simple music. Please do not take it as that. I am asking you to write things as simply as possible. Things can be complex, but do every effort to make them no more complex than absolutely needed. Because anything more than that is just going to be causing problems in the production process, taking time away from rehearsals, if you can find a way that's simpler to do it. So I said triage. I know I'm running a little bit late. I'm sorry. So
yeah, do we want to do, oh, I'm sorry. Do we want to do questions? Does anybody have any questions? What is the name / author of the book on voice that you held up earlier?
Wait, what was that?
In the chat.
Oh.
Kristen, not your wife, says, what's the name / author of the book on voice that you held up earlier?
This one here is in German. It's the Handbuch der Oper by Kläuber. It is published by Bärenreiter. It is considered sort of the Bible in the German-speaking world, and this is what everyone is going to. There's probably only, if you don't speak German, it's maybe not the most useful thing. Oh, the Richard Baudry book, I think, is the other one, which I had. That's the, do I have it here? Richard Baudry book. And that's what actually the pages I gave out. You took classes with him. That's freaking awesome. He's awesome. It's like so much great information that he had there. Okay, other questions? Okay, then until you think of them, I'm going to tell you, these are a few things that you can do in that will take you literally less than 10 minutes of time, that will save hours of work with, or the singer's work, which will make them so happy to work with you. So first, put rehearsal numbers in all your music. You would be amazed at how much time singers end up spending breaking it down and then realizing, I don't know, that was a horrible way to break it down. Let me re-break it down. Do that for us. You're writing the music, you know it well. 2, the default settings on Finale, on Dorico, on Sibelius, on Muse Score for vocal music are awful in that they are way too small. And most of us end up spending a huge amount of time having to hold the music up and going back and forth. Adjust the page settings, make it bigger. I talked about Joan Dornaman before. She's famous for teaching singers music ridiculously fast. One of the ways she does that is have them write on big pieces of paper the music. That seems like it shouldn't work. You'd be amazed at how fast it will get music into singers' minds. So if you print it bigger, they will be happier. They will do better. Consider your page turns when you're writing music or printing music. I'd rather have more pages and more page turns if they make sense. What do I mean by that? Don't have an entrance on the downbeat of the first page. Don't break up the phrase if possible. Basically that, yeah? Also, go with piano reductions that you send singers over orchestral reductions. This goes for files and for the music. That is how we are trained. We are trained to look at piano vocal scores for whatever it is, whether it be a song or whether it be an opera. And so it's one less barrier that we have to have psychologically looking at your music, even if we're going to be performing it with orchestra. Sending files, here's the biggest thing that I will say. Again, the default settings on Dorico, Finale, all these, Sibelius, has a vocal ah sound. It is the most frustrating thing to receive vocal ahs. The reason for this, very briefly, is that they are designed to blend. And I take a track when I get it, and it is not for, shall we say, a highfalutin artistic purposes that I listen to. It is woodshedding. It is, I want to sing the right notes and I want to sing the right rhythms. And so if I have a voice that I can't hear or it's blending in too much, it creates huge frustration. Sankaram, I don't know how many are familiar with her. All the singers I know who have worked with her rave about the fact that they'll be like, oh, she sent me my part, but I was a saxophone in it, and will be like, this was a revelation to them and think it's the greatest thing. I highly encourage you on your default settings to change that to make the tenor a trumpet, make the soprano or mezzo oboe, make the bass a bassoon or trombone, depending on what sort of type of singer you want to have there. But make it blatant so that we can hear what those notes are, we can hear that rhythm, get rid of the vocal ahs. Now, when you're sending, so that's with the PDFs that you're going to be sending. The other part of this is when you send files, I actually think you should be sending 5. And I think that you should be sending a MIDI or a music XML file to everyone. And when I say that, I do mean .midi or .musicxml. The reason for that is because I'm 45 years old. I've been on computers since I was 8 years old. I have the technology. If you send me a MIDI or a music XML, I can put it into one of my dozen programs. I can jump to measure 53 to rehearse that entrance that comes in at 55 that I'm having trouble with. I don't have to go through and listen and pay attention for all leading up to there if it's just that one little section. Plus, it makes sense financially. I don't have to pay a pianist. I don't have to spend as much of my energy and time doing all those things. Send a MIDI, send a music XML. I think you should probably still send MP3s or WAV files, but you should be sending 4 of them. The 4 you should send are, you should send the piano with the voice, not as a vocal ah, and a click. You should send the piano and the voice without a click. You should send the piano with a click, and you should send the piano without a click. Those 4 things, because those would be super useful to me and would cut out, again, hours and hours and hours of my time and frustration that I can spend making your music sound better. And that's what you want. You want the singers that you have to sound the best, because as I said, they're going to be the front man for your music. They're going to be the way that your music is experienced first and foremost by the audiences. So you want them to do the best job possible. Can you please repeat those 4 MP3s? Yes. Piano, voice, click. Piano, voice, no click track. Piano, click track. Piano, no click track. And you should send either an XML or a MIDI file. And I would make, again, it's going to take you an extra 2 minutes to export all of those as opposed to just exporting it once. It will make a difference. Questions? I've just yelled at you all for an hour. I'm sorry. I'm gonna have a drink now.
I just had a quick question. Can we
Yeah.
actually get the handouts in an email as well? I had a little trouble.
So yeah, I'm compiling a Google Drive
Okay.
folder for, so all of your Zoom rehearsal links, we'll record those, and those will also be in here. And all of Dan's handouts will be in there as well.
Jonathan, so you asked about musical theater versus opera in terms of role and Fach categories. So the biggest difference here is that in most musical theater, the singer's format is not required. In fact, often it is frowned upon because at this point in time, most of it is amplified. I still think the best musicals and best musical theater writers will go with similar Fach ideas. Generally, all the voices here would be towards the light lyric end of it, with a few exceptions, like a Sweeney Todd would really probably be a bass baritone or dramatic baritone. And some of those are done in opera companies. But the biggest thing that I've seen is that a lot of composers today in musical theater don't have a good concept of what voices are, so they just call baritenor with a high C and a low C, or they just will list the range. And again, it takes no consideration into the tessitura. And so what I've seen when Broadway was open was a just total mixed bag of results. I've seen some miraculous things there, and some things I've gotten my money back for because they were just atrocious. So I think that you can think very much in the same way. Generally, the lighter lyric voices will do the crossover, will do the musical theater, will do the operetta, if you're interested in that writing. And there will be roles for in those 28, 30 things that I had, but the leading parts will generally be lyric or light lyric. And it's usually an exception if you're going to have a more dramatic voice, they'll be the older characters. And then the belting voice will fit into one of them, usually the dramatic. You have some belters like Ethel Merman, or, who had supposedly one of the largest voices ever. And it's, what specific composers are learning. I feel learning a style is very general. Okay. Does that answer your question, Jonathan, kind of? Okay. So when composers learn singers' repertoire, what specific composers are we learning? Is that what the question is? So this is my question to you, is what type of voices do you like? I would, instead of saying what composers should you look at, I would say, listen to the voices, and what is the voice that if you say, oh, I heard this voice, I love that voice. Well, what repertoire did they do? Does that make sense? Suzanne, is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, it kind of makes sense. I feel like although they have very different repertoire and very different style, but for composers, say we just learn that style and put that style into our music, it's kind of like a bit difficult for us to do that because also we need to combine with our own style. Yeah,
Totally.
Like, what is that maybe vocal technique we are looking at their different singers, their specific repertoire?
Yeah. So again, I would start with you to just say, what do I listen to? I mean, I think Verdi and Wagner are two of the best vocal writers around. I think they're brilliant. They're not for everyone. I think that the bel cantos period, Donizetti, Rossini, Bellini, have a huge amount to teach you. I actually happen to personally love Handel and his writing, especially for voice. I think it's like taking a break as I get to sing Handel, because I know Elizabeth hates me for saying that, but I think it fits really well. So where I gave you the rubric before about the range, the tessitura, the flexibility, things like that, I would say, if you hear something you like, because it's too much it's going to take you a lifetime to hear it all. But if you hear a voice you like, go on that list, what comes up, and find the pieces. If you find something that you like, oh, I want that, I would then do a dive into that. See, where does that piece lie? Where does that singer lie? And I would sort of look at that. Again, some people really will gravitate towards a lighter voice, and that's what they like to sing with, or that's what they want to write for. Some people really want a very dramatic voice to write for. I've gotten some music which has just been going up and down scales and in tonalities, and they're all sort of different. But I would say it's a really good exercise to sort of emulate not that you're going to write Handel the way Handel did, but say, oh, this is how he writes his runs. They sort of hang out in this part of the voice for that one. And he's writing for this soprano or this castrato, and that singer, this is what he wrote. Well, what else was written for that castrato? You can, as I said, Wikipedia is a great source. You can see that for, what's his name? Farinelli is the most famous, but Guadagni is one of the famous singers that he wrote for. And you'll be able to go through and see like, oh, Guadagni, he wrote everything in this way. And it can be a very good learning lesson that way. Does that help?
So we can probably do one more question. I'm really sorry, guys.
No.
So does anybody have one final big question?
I do. Yep, I have a question.
Go for it.
Hey, Daniel, nice meeting you.
Pleasure.
Simmer, it's my first name. I had a quick question. So I know we obviously talked about each individual voice type, right? But let's say you're writing for multiple singers, which is usually the case anyway, whether it's opera or art song. So is there maybe different combinations in voice types that are more common, that are more usually like more written for, depending on the atmosphere that you're trying to create, or depending on the mood and the emotion that you're trying to evoke?
I wouldn't say there's a certain combination. I mean, generally in the Italian school or the German, we have a lot of the tenors being the leading man. We have the lyric soprano. If it's a lyric soprano, it'll usually be a lyric tenor, and they will sort of be matched together as the sort of romantic lead of the couple. You find in French, they like to have the sort of the baritone and the mezzo soprano as being the leads. One of the things that I think is fascinating is that there are differences. Like, for example, usually in most music that we hear in the States in opera, we have this very high light voice is supposed to be the young girl. In most of the Slavic countries, they have a contralto. The lowest female voice is the young girl. And they just have that totally different idea of what it is. So there's a lot of variation there. And different schools have different approaches to it, where like a lot of the English, a lot of they're in their choral writing, for example, they really want to have a blend of sounds, where a lot of the Italians tend to find like, you got a weird voice and you got a weird voice. Let me put those together and see what happens. Okay. And sometimes you get weird sounds and sometimes you get beautiful sounds. And I will just say, if you don't know who Maria Callas is, you should, but she was one of the most famous singers, and her name in Italy was La Grande Brutta Voce, the big ugly voice. And they worshipped her like a goddess. They literally called her La Divina, but it was the big ugly voice that they worshipped. So it was more about what she did with it as opposed to it being beautiful. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it kind of sounds like you're saying at the end of the day, when it comes to writing for multiple singers, you go where your ear takes you. There isn't necessarily, like with Germans, obviously, right? Their ear, if I can say it that way, is rather evolved from the music that they've written and listened to. Same thing with the French, same thing with the Italian. So as as a composer, in 2021, it's really where has your, what kind of music has been your influence, right? And at the end of the day, it's, if you're writing for multiple singers,
we also have to remember that while we're learning about opera and the traditional Western opera, there's voice fox and voice types and techniques that are beyond the Western tradition.
Absolutely.
Of course.
And this is, and I absolutely agree with Jillian here.
Dan was in our production, Fresh Squeeze Opera's production of Bound by Hoang Rao, which mixed traditional Vietnamese styles and instruments with, that's like his whole thing is not in a bad way, east meets west, like not in a sticky, not in like a Madame Butterfly kind of offensive way, but in a really nice way.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally understand. I mean, I think to me that was basically implied, right? I think we were just using kind of some examples that are a little bit more common.
I mean,
yeah.
I was going to say that, if you're writing opera, it's still, although I agree there are many other schools of singing, the primary one that you're going to be dealing with if you're writing traditional, quote, opera, is you're going to be dealing with traditionally trained singers. So I want you to sort of getting into that state of mind and how they're trained will save you so much effort if you say like, oh, these are the tools that are right there at my hands. And there are a huge amount. I mean, there are 30, 28 different types of voices that I listed. And that's because I cut it down so much.
Yeah.
So and people will really think like, oh, this is the music that makes sense to me. And that's the vocalism that makes sense to me. And so use that to your advantage as much as possible.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, right? Because for me, like I've grown up with, listening to Western music, but also listening to Indian classical or just Indian music in general. And so the way that I generally write or the way that I approach things is my ear is going to go somewhere that maybe not someone who's, traditionally trained in Western music may go. But at the end of the day, if I'm writing an art song, right? So it's always a combination. It's always a blend of those things. It's never one or the other. And I think that's natural,
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I know when I was talking with Leo a few weeks ago about his piece, there are things that when in a situation like this, you'll look at it and there are things that I think you can make decisions on about, as I talked about the simplicity idea is like, if you can find simpler ways to do it, it's going to save rehearsal time. And like for this process, we had a certain amount of time that I can be with the pianist and I can be with you to rehearse it. So things that you have to make decisions, and it's a little bit of that triage thing, like this is what's important to me. That's going to take too long, so we're going to throw that out, but we're going to do this here. And that's why I started out by talking about we exist in this market. And I know I hate thinking about marketplaces and music, but it's reality.
It's necessary, for sure.
It's necessary to not say that it controls what you do, but it should be a factor in what you're thinking. And you can choose to say, I'm thinking about it, I'm going to throw it all away. And that's legit.
Yeah.
But as long as you've thought about it, is my key.
So you guys can understand why Dan is a really great DM, because he's very good at talking and he's very good at illustrating things. And unfortunately, we do have to stop.
Understood.
So we're going to take 5 minutes. You can stay in this window, or you can just stop your video and mute yourself. And then we're going to group back and start our composer presentations. Thank you so much, Dan.
It was my pleasure, Jillian. And it was a pleasure meeting all of you in person. Well, not in person, but on